Vietnam and China sit right next to each other on the map. They share centuries of history, cultural exchange, similar foods, and even familiar traditions. On the surface, many things feel the same. You might even think that daily life follows similar rules, but once you spend real time in both places, something interesting begins to show. Small, everyday habits, things people barely notice, suddenly carry very different meanings. A gesture that feels harmless in Vietnam can feel awkward in China. A normal question can feel uncomfortable. Even silence, body language, or the way someone refuses an offer can quietly change how they are seen. One burping loudly at the table. In Vietnam, picture a casual meal. Plastic chairs pulled close together, shared dishes in the middle of the table, people talking over each other, laughing, reaching for food. When the meal ends, someone lets out a small burp. No one looks up. No one reacts. It's simply part of the moment. At most, it's ignored. It doesn't signal anything special and it doesn't offend anyone. It's neutral. Now shift that same scene to China. The table looks similar, the food is generous. The atmosphere is warm. But here, things are more nuanced. Burping is not considered polite in modern Chinese dining, especially in formal settings. However, in some traditional or older rural contexts, a burp after a hearty meal may be interpreted casually as a sign that someone is full and satisfied. Not praised, not encouraged, but understood. And here's where the real difference shows. In Vietnam, burping is mostly ignored. In China, it's more context-dependent. It can be quietly tolerated in informal situations, but it's generally avoided in polite company. And importantly, staying silent is always safe and respectful. So it's not really about burping being good or bad. It's about awareness. About knowing when a small habit blends into the background and when it suddenly stands out. And this is a good place to pause for a moment. Because if even something this small depends on context, what happens when we use words? What happens when we say no? 2. Being direct when saying no. In Vietnam, directness is often seen as practical, especially in everyday situations or informal settings. If something doesn't work, people may simply say no or say it clearly without much wrapping. There may not be a long explanation, and the tone is usually straightforward. Most of the time, this is taken as honesty rather than disrespect. The message matters, and clarity is often appreciated. Now imagine that same moment in China. A direct no, especially in social or professional settings, can feel heavy. It can cause what's known as loss of face or mianzi. Rather than refusing outright, people often soften their response. They hesitate. They suggest another time. They say things like, "We'll see," or "It might be difficult." The answer may already be no, but it's delivered indirectly to protect harmony. Here's where the real difference comes from. In China, how something is said often matters as much as what is said. Preserving relationships means avoiding sharp or final-sounding refusals. In Vietnam, while politeness still matters, being clear and upfront is more socially acceptable in many situations, especially among peers. Neither approach is better. They're simply different ways of managing relationships, expectations, and social balance. And once you start paying attention to how people say no, you begin to notice something else too. Not just the words, but how freely people express themselves and how much space they're given to stand out. 3. Individualistic self-expression. In Vietnam, there often feels like a little more room to breathe in everyday life. People joke easily, they laugh loudly, they enjoy their free time without constantly worrying about fitting a perfect image. Being playful, spontaneous, or casually expressive doesn't automatically attract judgment, especially among friends or in social spaces. Many people describe the atmosphere as relaxed, even chill. But now shift the scene to China, particularly in large cities. The pace feels more structured. Expectations are clearer. Study seriously. Work seriously. Follow the path that leads to stability. Standing out too much, dressing very differently, or behaving in ways that disrupt group norms can quietly attract disapproval. Not necessarily confrontation, but subtle signals that something feels off. But here's where the difference really comes from. China places strong value on discipline, consistency, and collective responsibility. These values are deeply tied to its education system and work culture. Vietnam also values community, but daily social life often allows more casual expression, especially outside formal settings. And once you start noticing how people express themselves, you begin to notice something else too. Not in words, but in body language. How close people stand, how comfortable they are with touch, and what kind of physical closeness feels natural in public spaces. 4. Same-sex physical affection in public. Now in Vietnam, it's quite common to see close friends walking together with arms linked, shoulders touching, or hands loosely held. Men do this with male friends, and women do the same with women. In most cases, it feels natural and unremarkable. It's understood as platonic, a simple sign of closeness, familiarity, and comfort between people who trust each other. But picture a similar scene in China. In some rural areas or among younger people, you may still see same-sex friends walking closely or holding hands. But in modern urban settings, especially among adults, it's far less common. People tend to keep more physical distance in public spaces. The behavior isn't forbidden, but it can feel out of place or attract curious looks rather than blending into the background. And the key difference? Well, in Vietnam, physical closeness between friends is widely understood as social and non-symbolic. It doesn't invite interpretation. In China, public behavior is more restrained, and people are often more aware of how actions might be perceived by others, especially in crowded or formal environments. So once you start noticing how people interact physically, another difference begins to surface. Not in touch this time, but in conversation. The kinds of questions people feel comfortable asking, and how personal those questions are allowed to be. 5. Asking very personal questions. In Vietnam, personal questions often come early, especially in casual or social settings. Someone might ask your age, whether you're married, if you have children, or even what you do for a living. In some cases, income may come up too. Most of the time, this isn't meant to pry or judge. It's a way of placing you socially, understanding your stage in life and showing friendly interest. The questions feel informal, almost routine. So now place that same interaction in China. Personal questions also exist, but the boundaries are more situational. Age, hometown, job, and marital status may feel normal, particularly when asked by elders or in family contexts. However, asking directly about salary, wealth, or financial status is more sensitive. It can feel intrusive or face-threatening, especially if asked too early or by someone without close standing. Why does this difference exist? In China, personal success is closely tied to social standing, reputation, and comparison within a wider system. Questions about money can quietly place someone higher or lower in a social hierarchy. In Vietnam, while status still matters, these topics often feel more casual and conversational in everyday life, especially outside formal settings. And once you start paying attention to what people ask, you begin to notice something else too. Not in conversation this time, but in belief. The quiet rules people follow and the superstitions they choose to treat as flexible or fixed. 6. Superstitions in everyday life. Vietnam and China share many traditional superstitions, and one of the most familiar involves chopsticks. Placing them upright in a bowl of rice is avoided in both cultures because it resembles incense offered to the dead at funerals. That shared understanding exists on both sides, but how seriously these rules are followed in daily life can feel quite different. In Vietnam, many superstitions are known, but they're often treated with flexibility. People may mention them, joke about them, or adjust them depending on the situation. Some avoid taking photos of 3 people together, believing the person in the middle might attract bad luck. Others downplay compliments to newborns, especially from outsiders, to avoid drawing unwanted attention from spirits. These beliefs are present, but they're not always rigid. Context often decides how strictly they're followed. However, in China, superstition tends to be more systematized. Numbers carry strong meaning, especially in business and daily decisions. Certain gifts are avoided because of how their names sound. Colors, symbols, and even everyday items like hats can send unintended messages. These associations are deeply embedded, and breaking them can feel uncomfortable rather than casual, particularly in formal or family settings. Here's where the difference really comes from. In Vietnam, superstition often acts as guidance, something to be aware of but open to interpretation. In China, superstition functions more like a symbolic framework, a shared system that helps maintain meaning, order, and social awareness. And when you step back and look at everything together, the differences aren't dramatic on the surface. They live in small moments: a pause at the table, a softened refusal, a question asked too early, a gesture that lingers just a second longer than expected. And that's what makes culture fascinating. 7. Speaking casually to elders or authority figures. In Vietnam, it's fairly common to hear relaxed conversations between younger people and elders, teachers, or even bosses, but usually after a relationship has been established. Respect is still shown through titles, tone, and body language, yet the interaction often feels warm and human. In family settings or familiar workplaces, light joking or casual back and forth can happen without being seen as disrespectful. It often signals closeness rather than a lack of manners. Now shift that same interaction to China. The atmosphere becomes more formal. Hierarchy plays a stronger role in everyday communication, especially in public or professional settings. The way you speak to elders or superiors carries clear weight. Tone, word choice, and even posture quietly communicate respect. Speaking too casually, joking too freely, or sounding overly familiar can feel inappropriate, particularly if the relationship isn't very close. So here's where the difference comes from. Chinese culture places strong emphasis on Confucian hierarchy, where roles are clearly defined and carefully maintained. Vietnam shares similar roots, but in daily life, those rules are often applied more flexibly once trust and familiarity are built. And once you begin to notice how people speak to authority, another difference starts to surface. Not in tone this time, but in timing. How people treat time itself and how flexible schedules are allowed to be. 8. Flexibility with time and schedules. In Vietnam, time often feels a little more flexible, especially outside formal business settings. If someone arrives a bit late, it's rarely a big issue. Plans can shift. Meetings start when everyone arrives. People adapt, laugh it off, and move on. There's an unspoken understanding that life happens and relationships matter more than the clock. But place that same situation in China. Time carries more weight. Punctuality is closely observed, especially at work or during formal meetings. Being late can quietly suggest a lack of seriousness or respect. Schedules tend to be tighter, expectations clearer, and even small delays can affect how reliable someone is perceived to be. So why does this matter? Well, it is because in China, time is closely tied to discipline, productivity, and collective efficiency. Keeping to schedules shows commitment to the group. In Vietnam, especially in social life, relationships often take priority over rigid timing. And once you start paying attention to how people treat time, you begin to notice something else as well. How people talk about their daily struggles, their work, and the frustrations they carry, and whether those feelings are shared openly or kept quietly inside. 9. Openly complaining about work, stress, or daily life. In Vietnam, it's very common to hear people vent. Complaints about work, traffic, money, or daily stress slip easily into conversation. Someone talks about a hard day, others nod, laugh, or add their own story. It's rarely taken seriously or seen as negative. Most of the time, it's simply a way to bond, to release pressure, and to feel understood. However, in China, complaining openly, especially in public or at work, can feel risky. It may come across as negative, ungrateful, or disruptive to group harmony. Instead of venting freely, people often keep frustrations to themselves or share them only within very trusted circles. So here's where the difference comes from. In China, maintaining a stable and positive group atmosphere is highly valued. Emotional restraint helps protect harmony. In Vietnam, emotional expression is often more open, and sharing frustrations feels socially acceptable. And once you notice what people choose to say out loud, you start to notice something else as well. How people relate to rules in everyday life, and whether those rules feel fixed or flexible depending on the situation. 10. Casual attitudes toward rules in everyday situations. In Vietnam, rules in daily life often feel negotiable. People may bend them slightly, find workarounds, or rely on personal judgment in the moment. This usually isn't seen as wrongdoing, it's more like practical problem solving, a way of adapting to real world situations as they come. Now, shift that same moment to China. Rules tend to be taken more seriously, especially in public spaces. Whether it's queuing, regulations, or official procedures, there's a stronger expectation of compliance. Ignoring rules can attract attention more quickly, and consequences may follow. Where does this difference come from? China's long history of centralized governance and emphasis on social order plays a role. Clear rules help maintain structure in a large, complex society. Vietnam also values order, but daily life often leaves more room for flexibility and informal solutions. So, when you look at Vietnam and China from a distance, the differences don't always jump out. The food feels familiar, the history overlaps, the values sound similar, but as you've seen, culture often lives in the smallest details. A pause before saying no, how close people stand. A question asked too early, a rule quietly followed or gently bent. None of these moments are dramatic on their own, but together they shape how people understand respect, comfort, and belonging. They remind us that culture isn't about who's right or wrong, it's about context, about knowing when something blends into the background and when it suddenly carries weight. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The more we notice these small differences, the easier it becomes to move through the world with awareness instead of assumptions. So, if any of these moments surprised you, let me know in the comments. Which difference stood out the most, or have you experienced one of these situations yourself? If you enjoyed this kind of calm, thoughtful comparison, consider subscribing. There's more to explore just beneath the surface, and sometimes the smallest details tell the biggest stories.